You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Hello, I'm Steven Willis from the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. He is Michael Katz from the Northeast Mississippi Tupelo Daily Journal. He's joining us to talk all about the openness that is Ole Miss football, and everybody obviously knows everything. How we doing, Mike?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, man. I do know that from what I've heard from the people I've talked to around Oxford this week, they've been more bunkered than they usually are. Is that true?
I think that's fair. I think that game was kind of stunning, wasn't it?
It was fluky. People can say what they want to, and all the disappointment aside that Ole Miss lost the game, that was a very fluky football game with a lot of stuff that's not repeatable.
But it happened the one time it needed to for Kentucky.
Yeah, they got the W. Good for them and everything, but I don't think people that are watching this game and the results of that game, and they're getting ready to like doom stroll on Twitter and all of that stuff. I was like, let's take a deep breath. There's a lot of stuff that went really wrong. Now, Ole Miss played horribly. I'm not saying they didn't. And Kentucky played nearly a perfect game. But if you add that with the fluky stuff, I think Ole Miss is going to be all right. And history says, and you can look this up whenever you're doing stuff for Saturday's game, Jackson Dart doesn't generally have bad games 2 in a row. After he has a bad game or a mid game, the next game was like the LSU game at 377 yards, the Vanderbilt game of 450 yards, the Mississippi State game where he was 30 for 38. He traditionally bounces back pretty well. So I don't know. I don't think that Ole Miss fans should. There's a lot in front of Ole Miss fans right now, and the playoff and all the goals are still on the table. And until the South Carolina game happens, I don't know if anybody can make a decision one way or another on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is still the number 12 team in the country. This is still a team that is very well thought of in national circles. I think people are surprised with how that game went. And
very.
Count me among them. I did not see it playing out the way it did. But, I know it can be coach speak, it can be player speak, but I do think that they understand that this doesn't mean it's all over. This is a different era of college football. You have more room for error now, and of course that's subjective, and who knows how that looks in the grand scheme of things, later in the year. But it's not like this takes you out of, the last dance mindset that you had coming in. Now, if they lose this weekend, I think things get really interesting.
Yeah.
But I think for right now, it's all right there. It's just they got to take care of business.
Yeah, the margin for error basically has been removed. But if Ole Miss wins against South Carolina on the road and they beat LSU in Tiger Stadium, Ole Miss is essentially in the same spot that everybody thought they would be in after that LSU game.
You traded out Kentucky for LSU, basically.
Yeah, and they should be fine. But they have to win these games. And with what's going on in the offseason with Juice Wells, with Lane Kiffin trolling South Carolina fans with the 2001 music with a Juice Wells highlight in the preseason, this game is going to be a cauldron this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it's Lane has been very quiet on social media this week, and it's understandable. Probably a good week not to rile up the Gamecocks, because they I don't think they need any more reasons to be excited for this one. That should be an electric environment.
Yeah, and they have a good team. I do not want to hear any South Carolina fans that watch this video that say that I don't think they have a good team, because we have this weird thing in a society right now that if you pick your team to win, you're automatically disrespecting their team. And that's just not the case. Now, I genuinely don't think that South Carolina is as good of a program as Ole Miss right now. I'm not saying that South Carolina can't win the game. I'm saying that if Ole Miss plays its best and South Carolina plays its best, Ole Miss is going to win the game.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a South Carolina team that has been better than I expected. Obviously, I think that, that game against Old Dominion to start the year really was like, people were like, oh no, like this might be a really bad year for them. And they beat the brakes off Kentucky, and I do think that was a very weird Kentucky game, even for them. They almost beat LSU. If Lenore Sellers doesn't get hurt, they probably win that game.
Yeah.
And then you can't learn a ton against Akron, but they did what they needed to do. I think it's a very solid team. This is not a gimme. As we saw, there are no gimmies in the SEC. That much has become very, very clear.
Honestly, Ole Miss fans need to thank LSU right now, because LSU winning that game is probably the reason the South Carolina game isn't the 7:00 ABC game. And that place would be absolutely going bonkers. Sandstorm, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, no, this being an afternoon game is I know that home field, some people don't think it's that big. I think it is a huge deal. And I think that it not being at night is really, really big. If they could have gotten that lucky for LSU the next week, that probably would have been great for them. But it's the 100th anniversary of Tiger Stadium next week. So that is a 6:30 start, I believe. So you can't win them all, but this is a game that I think they did not need this to be a sandstorm game.
Yes, this not being a night game is the blessing in disguise. Ole Miss needs to figure out a way to win this game by 1 point or 50 points. However you can get the W, and go down to Baton Rouge. Let's tee it up and see what happens. That's the way this is going to work. When we come back, we'll start talking specifically about the Ole Miss South Carolina game on this pre-game show. This is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. Stick around. Hey, NFL fans, you can start your season with a big return on FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. It's the place to bet on which side of Ole Miss being a 9.5-point favorite over the South Carolina Gamecocks, or maybe you just like the over-under number at 53.5 points. Ole Miss would have been right near that number all by themselves in most of their games this season. So if you have a hunch like that in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more in the same place where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. I do want to welcome a new partner on the Locked On Ole Miss podcast in College Corner. It is your one-stop shop for all things Ole Miss. Game day is just around the corner, just a couple of hours away. Ole Miss will be kicking off against South Carolina. It's a powder game. So if you're going to that game, be sure to wear your powder gear. Head on over to the College Corner if you want to pick up whatever you want to pick up for your perfect game day gear. Just ask Scott, who just got a bunch of new Realtree Galaxy tumblers with more stuff on the way, whether you're gearing up for football, basketball, or baseball. College Corner has you covered, and located off of Sisk Avenue, right across from the new Chick-fil-A, and getting to the store is a breeze, and they have a ton of parking. For those of you out of state, no worries. Visit collegecornerstore.com, where they turn around orders lightning fast. Trust me, this just isn't a pitch. College Corner is where I get all of my Rebel gear. So visit collegecornerstore.com or stop by College Corner today. All right, Michael, let's turn our attention to the game. And we mentioned Jackson Dart, how he rarely has bad games or even mid-games back-to-back weeks. So I expect Jackson to play well. I expect Ole Miss to not lean so heavily on Trey Harris. If Ole Miss is as bunkered as I think they've been, and everybody's told me they are this week, I'm expecting a little bit more of a sense of urgency game plan. And I think Lane Kiffin is going to find a way to get Juice Wells a touchdown if he can, just because that is just something that Lane Kiffin would do. And I expect the tight end to be used. Now, the question that I have is, you look at the availability report, not injury report, availability report. Henry Parrish and Matt Jones are both listed as questionable at the moment. Now, if it's not saying out, you probably shouldn't pay attention to it on Wednesday, but them being on it is at least relevant. Is this the week that Ulysses Bentley finally makes an appearance? Is he the October surprise for Ole Miss football?
Is he Mr. October? I don't know, but yeah. Again, the availability report is just such a it's gone exactly how I think we all thought it would, in terms of there being a billion names and it all being extremely nebulous, and the only guys that are out are guys who tore their ACLs like in the spring or last year and are recovering. We know those guys are going to be out. I don't even think they need to be on the report. But there's just a lot of names on there that, there's gamesmanship. I think that's how this was always going to be from Ole Miss's perspective. As we know, Lane has always been very coy with the health status of his team. It's not like all of a sudden it was going to be an open book. He's playing the system the way that he wants to play it. So, but I think it really does depend on the severity of the whatever ailments those two have. It would be hard for me to see Henry Parrish not playing just because of how important he has been. I'm not sure what Parrish has been hit really hard the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, he was hobbled against Kentucky at the end. There was one time where you were like, he needs to come out of the game.
Yeah, he's taken some licks the last couple of weeks. But again, it's for how important he's been for the running game. It's hard to not see him being there. I'm not sure what exactly the deal with Matt Jones is, but again, like if there was a week for you to release Ulysses Bentley, this seems like it would probably be it. It's every week. It's the question Lane gets, and someone always has to ask it because it's really sort of mind-boggling how he hasn't become part of the rotation yet. I think, like, for me at least, I was like, okay, they're saving him for SEC play, and they didn't save it. It wasn't against Kentucky. Maybe saving it for later in SEC play, but. Eventually you got to get your best players on the field. And I think that he is a really good player.
During the offseason, we all said it's like, okay, Ole Miss is bringing all these transfers and they're preparing for a 16-game season. Everything's preparing for depth. Everything like that is going to happen. That's what Lane is doing. Now that we're 5 games into the season, the offensive line rotation is just like it's always been. The running back rotation is actually slower. The wide receivers, everything looks the same. I think Ole Miss fans are going to have to ask the question is like, well, why did we spend all these millions of dollars on these extra players if we're not going to use them?
Yeah, the running back rotation has been a lot smaller than I thought it was going to be. I'm not surprised Henry Parrish is getting a ton of touches. He was a good player the first time he was here, and he's produced everywhere he's been. That was never. I don't think that's super surprising, but Bentley not being a part of the rotation and Rashad Amos being MIA for the most part. Again, this is a guy who ran for 1,000 yards and a bunch of touchdowns last year at Miami, Ohio. And I understand it's Miami, Ohio, and it's different, but you have to think that, like, they don't bring these guys in if they don't think that they can contribute. You don't just have bodies to have bodies. Yeah, there's too much money at stake. So it's really interesting the way that rotation specifically has worked thus far, and there's still a chance it completely changes. But through 5 games, it's that running back room has been a lot smaller than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, and the normal thing that people say about Ole Miss and the collective and the Ole Miss fan base is they have to be efficient. They have to be efficient. Everything. They're not going to ever be Texas, but they have to be efficient. And if you're just bringing guys in to bring them in, that's not very efficient.
Yeah, I mean, listen, no one is going to say that the money spent on Walter Nolan and Princely was not worth it. Those guys have been incredible. Mm-hmm. But you look at some of the other guys, again, the guys who haven't seen the field as much, and it makes you question, like, what is the plan? Is there something we're not seeing? Were they not the players you thought they were? Did you miss free agent? Teams miss in free agency. Mm-hmm. It happens. That's professional sports. That's the gamble. It's going to be interesting to look back at the end of the year and see if they whiffed on anybody.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see exactly what happens because the South Carolina game, like I said, they're going to have a ton of energy. They have one of the better defensive lines in all of college football. If you look at PFF, they think they have the best defensive line in college football. I think this might be the game of the dreaded jet sweep. I think Ole Miss is going to try and make that defensive line run side to side. They're going to try and move the quarterback. They're going to try and make them unpredictable because Kyle Kennard is a good player and Dylan Stewart's going to be a first-round draft pick whenever he graduates. If you drop back up Jackson Dart and let him throw from a single spot like they did against Kentucky, South Carolina will eat them alive.
I do think, and again, like this is a very good South Carolina defense, but it's a very different defense than Kentucky was. And I think that in some ways it might be a better matchup for what Ole Miss wants to do just because it's not going to be that strength right up the middle, because that throws everything off when you get those guys up the middle. But you can work around edge rushers like that. That is you can step up in the pocket, you can roll your guy out. But I think that the strength and up the middle stuff that Kentucky was able to do was just such a bad matchup for Ole Miss. I think that, bully ball is really hard to beat, especially when you're a team that likes to go fast. And, you're not necessarily always used to playing that way. But I think that's the South Carolina defense, while very, very good and has really good athletes, I think Ole Miss is designed. I think they'll be okay against speed and good athletes, because it's not the same physicality and strength that Kentucky had.
Yeah, that Ole Miss team had like 3 called running plays, actual running back plays in the first half. And I don't care if you are that strong up the middle. That's not something you can win SEC football games doing.
Agreed. And again, this seems like a week where, if the ends are the strength of that defensive line, is this when you start running up the middle again? Henry Parrish has been extremely effective between center and guard this year. He's averaging like 8.6 yards per carry between its middle left. So I think it's between the left guard and center. He's a really good runner up the middle if you give him the chance. I think matchups obviously matter and what you're facing. I think this is a better week to probably get the running game going early.
Yeah, and also expect the outside zone to reappear in Ole Miss's offense, and they're going to do some counter and some misdirection stuff. The running game is going to look much more sophisticated than it has to this point of the season.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it kind of has to. I don't think you can keep running the vanilla stuff anymore. These teams are getting too good. And again, like you said, like you want this South Carolina defense playing on its toes and being out of position and running side to side. If you can catch those ends biting the wrong way, you're going to be in a way better spot.
All right, when we come back, we will put our finishing touches on this Ole Miss South Carolina game, and I will talk to Michael about an interview that I had with a Columbia, South Carolina radio station this week that honestly, refreshingly, did not talk about Juice Wells. We'll talk about that in just a second, so stick around. Game Time is the place to get your Ole Miss tickets. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seats, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Ole Miss tickets. Vaught-Hemingway doesn't have a bad seat in the stadium, but Game Time makes it to where you can see exactly what the view would look like from that seat, so you can check it out before you buy. Their lowest price guarantee, event cancellation, job loss protection, all the customer service bells and whistles that you're rooting for. So take the guesswork out of buying Ole Miss tickets with Game Time. And with this being the most anticipated season in Ole Miss history, I might be able to help you out with tickets as well. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, Michael. It was really interesting because this week I've had to be very selective with the radio hits that I take, because when South Carolina stations wanted me to come on the air, about half of them were prepared for hit jobs because I was the account that released the Juice Wells social media video from the spring. Everybody remembered that, and there were people that going to assume one way or another and try to get me. It was some gotcha type stuff. So I was selective about that. But I did take the one that was the pregame show on the flagship station for the South Carolina Gamecocks. I mean, that makes sense. That felt pretty safe. And lo and behold, they didn't even ask about Juice Wells. And even after the interview was over, you kind of listened to them talking to see what they were going to say and reacting to it. He was like, well, Juice Wells hadn't done anything this year. Why do we even need to talk about it? And honestly, it was refreshing, and it was probably a good sign for maybe the crowd's going to calm down a little bit in this game.
Yeah, I mean, again, we'll see what happens on game day. I know a lot of South Carolina players were asked about it this week because obviously
and Shane Beamer.
Yes, and obviously that's a reporter's job is to ask those sorts of questions. Mm-hmm. We talked to Juice about it last week. We didn't get him this week, but we got him the week before, which I think was strategic, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But he was very measured and just he's like, it's another game for me. We just have to do what we have to do to win, that sort of thing. So maybe things have calmed down, but I do feel like if he has a big play or something, it's gonna get ugly.
Yeah. I genuinely think that Lane Kiffin, if he can get Juice Wells a touchdown in this game, especially on that opening drive of the game, when he does script, I think they're going to call him on a post route and try and hit him down the field. And if that happens, that place is going to explode.
The loudest boos I've ever heard were at in Knoxville a couple years ago with the golf ball game.
Yeah.
And obviously that was a very different level of booing. I think it could get pretty loud if that situation unfolds.
Yeah, there's been 2 other games that I remember that could be as bad and as hostile as this South Carolina game could be. And one is that Tennessee game, the French's Mustard and golf ball. The other is the Houston Nutt game in 2008 when Ole Miss went back to Fayetteville. Now, that game, like Chuck Rounsaville, somebody tried to fight him on the field after the game. It was that hostile of people going up to everybody. It was completely weird. Now, I'm sure there's some other ones like Ole Miss beating LSU in the 80s and all that. I'm sure that kind of got hostile as well. But those are the 2 games that I remember that could be close to this one if it does what I think it's going to do.
I now have to ask Chuck about this incident because this has piqued my interest immensely.
Yeah, basically Michael Oher pulled Chuck out of the way. So and diffuse that situation. If I remember that correctly, it seems like I've heard that story, but yeah, ask Chuck about that. That 2008 Arkansas game was legit crazy. Now, not so crazy as that Tennessee game where half the student section got kicked out of the game. That was completely a different thing, but it was still very intense. And also, that's the last time that Ole Miss has beaten Arkansas in Fayetteville.
Goodness.
Yeah, 2008. That's the last time that Ole Miss has beaten LSU in Baton Rouge in 2008. There's some work that Ole Miss needs to do this season to kind of reverse some trends.
Yeah, and again, I think this, an Ole Miss team that is currently down a little bit, but look at the opportunities that they have. You can change a lot of history with the rest of the season.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, everybody is going to be down. Everybody was told what could happen. When you look at what actually happened in that game, it was just a set of events that we've seen everybody do. I think a 6-6 team beat Ohio State in 2014 on Ohio State's home field.
Virginia Tech.
Yeah, it was Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
Ohio State ended up winning the national championship with a 3rd-team quarterback. Weirdness happens in college sports. Ole Miss has been on the response. I think on my show, I talked about Ole Miss beat Alabama in September in 2014 and 2015. They beat Florida in that time frame as well down there. They won the national title, and Ole Miss has a victory over Notre Dame, and that Notre Dame team ended up winning the national title. So winning early in October has never been a disqualifying factor for the playoffs, but you have to handle business after that.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing is just not letting one loss turn into more.
Yeah, and you can't be in a position to where you let Kentucky beat you twice because there's honestly no way that you bounce back from that.
100%.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
And before we get off of this, and one more last thing on Kentucky, Dan Mullen at Florida ruined my favorite joke of all time. And my favorite joke of all time was this: the Atlantic will beat Florida before Kentucky will. And that was my favorite joke ever. And now Florida can't beat Kentucky.
How the turntables have turned.
Yeah, it's absolutely nuts. But that joke and the other one was, if you need a quarterback to throw the ball 40 yards, Joe Milton can throw the ball 40 yards. If you need a quarterback to throw it 10 yards, Joe Milton can throw the ball 40 yards. That is my other favorite go-to joke.
And
anyway,
still relatively accurate.
Yes, pretty good. Anyway, thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Michael, what do you got going on at the Daily Journal, man?
So you might be wondering where I got that very specific Henry Parrish rushing stat from. I ran a story, I believe it ran today, just sort of analyzing Ole Miss's running game and where things have worked well, where the best success spots have been for them. It's really interesting to see where it's worked and where it hasn't worked as well. I mean, overall, the numbers still look pretty good for this Ole Miss rushing game. I think they're still like number 17 overall nationally in rushing yards, but there are definitely some places where it works better than others. And it was really interesting to see the Pro Football Focus numbers on that one.
Yeah, and you said it was the left guard.
I believe it was middle left. So I believe it was the gap between center and one of the guards. I think it was left.
Yeah, that feels like the Nate Kalepo thing because that feels So that's worth noticing before this game.
Yep.
Again, when you're dealing with these ends who want to get upfield and you do misdirection, I think this is a perfect opportunity to run screens, both regular, jailbreak, and bubble, and counters and reverses and jet sweeps. I think Lane gets this week to toy with defensive ends the same way that he did against the LSU Tigers a year ago.
This is with how vanilla things looked last week, you would have to think that this game plan is going to be a pretty
it's going to be thick. Yeah, it's going to be a thick one. Anyway, Michael, thank you very much, bud. We'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good, man. Appreciate you.